our favorite moment. Okay, I realized what the problem is, right, with this kind of abrupt start. It's not, it doesn't count down to like 0, 0. It counts down to like 0, 9, giving us an illusion that we still have 0.9 of a second, but we don't. And that's why we are never ready. Here we go. This is my contribution to the podcast today.
I'm glad you figured it out.
There you go, Professor.
Yeah, welcome everybody back to season 11 of Disasters Deconstructed. We're glad you're here with us. Thank you for that intro, Senya.
Anytime. Here for 11th season.
We kicked off this season a couple of weeks ago. I'm really very grateful for our upcoming guests. We have an amazing lineup of guests this season for live streams, and it's all related to politics of disaster, and it's something that we've talked about for years, many seasons, and that disasters are political, and from different angles we've approached this topic. So we finally decided to have a whole season on it, and we're going to run through November, right? Through live stream through November,
with a little break in the summer.
Yeah. So we're excited about this.
Yeah, super great. So, and if you haven't heard the first episode, please listen to it, watch it. Ricardo Fontalba helped us to introduce the season. And today we've got a new guest joining us, and we're really delighted to welcome Raja Swami. It's the first appearance of Raja on the podcast, so it's really wonderful to have you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Raja is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Tennessee, and Raja's research focuses on disasters, political economy, development, social justice, and climate change. So Raja published a book recently, Capitalism and Catastrophe. It is perhaps one of the best books I've read last year. If you haven't read it yet, absolutely read it. It's just fantastic. I don't know if you can see, but basically I torture my books. I'm the person who puts, who bends the corners and makes notes. So this book is just kind of full of notes and corners. And Jason and Camilo and I just recently did a paper where we cited you approximately 500 times because your work really resonates. So thank you so much for writing this book and for joining us today.
Thank you, Shania. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, we're so glad you're with us, Raja. So in this season, we're really kicking off our conversations with guests on the podcast with some similar questions at the start and end of episodes. And the first thing that we're asking our guests is this: what is a disaster for you?
So the word disaster itself, the first thing that comes to mind is sort of the flexibility of its meanings, right? A disaster can mean multiple things. Natural disaster, which is most commonly what we use the term for, but a disaster can mean, some kind of a break in the normal, some kind of a undoing of the normal. So the meanings of the word itself are in many ways sort of something that I'm drawn to think about when I'm asked the question, what is a disaster to you? Getting more specific, I'm kind of also interested in thinking about how disasters tend to be defined, tend to be spoken of in conventional terms. There's a certain temporality to disasters that often comes to mind, right? So we hear about a Hurricane Harvey, for example, in the fall of 2017, or Hurricane Katrina in the fall of 2005, or the Indian Ocean tsunami on December 26th, 2004, et cetera, et cetera. There's a sort of way in which disasters tend to be discretely identified and described in terms of time, and so in a way we've grown accustomed to the sort of conventional reading of disasters as these events, right? But I've also been kind of asking this question as to what extent can we imagine or think about disasters as events versus can we think about disasters in their processual kinds of qualities, right? So a famine or drought that extends over 20 years, 30 years, the long-term kind of transformations that we're seeing, for example, with the climate change, anthropogenic climate change. These are processes that are drawn out over time, and so that's one thing that also kind of intrigues me. More generally, and more, in fact, more particularly in terms of the book and what I've tried to do in this book, is to start thinking about thinking very systematically about the distinction we draw between disaster as event or process and those conditions that are often described and conventionally understood as normal conditions. And that distinction is where I make the entry point. I think the entry point ought to be for a critique. So think about disasters critically requires us to kind of hone in on those distinctions we draw between a disaster situation and a normal situation, and understand what is going on when a disaster, in fact, to cite Anthony Oliver Smith's formulation here, a disaster is when a hazard comes into contact or comes into interaction with a given social world and overwhelms the adaptive capacities of that social world. That's when you see a breakdown, right? So what is that relationship between a disaster situation and a kind of normal constitution of society is what I'm kind of interested in. I hope that somewhat answered the question.
Yeah, very much so. I love that you take us back to Tony Oliver Smith. He was has always been like an inspiration to us and a good friend, and was I think we had 2 episodes in our first season with Tony.
Yeah.
So that was 2019, right?
Yeah, God, a long time ago. Yeah, really. And if I can just follow up on this first question, it's interesting. I think for those of us who study disaster, we kind of almost understand that distinction between like normal, right? That it's not normal in a normal sense, and that's why I'm using quotation marks. And I guess we can also see how disaster doesn't really create suffering, right? It just exposes suffering, because for some people the normal, in quotation mark, is that the process of disaster, right? Kind of how do you frame this?
So one of the things that kept coming up in the course of my kind of study of disasters over the years, and speaking with people who are working on kind of recovering after a disaster, both people directly affected as well as non-governmental organizations, non-profits, people who are trying to help people, volunteers, and others, is that while the focus tends to be on the disaster and its suffering, right, the suffering imposed by a flood, a hurricane, etc., what often gets left out in the conventional analysis is that that what happened before the disaster really is very important. What was going on before? And because disasters, if we were to think about disasters in their sort of event-like qualities, they happen in worlds that are already going through all kinds of things, right? People are, struggling with unemployment, or people are fighting eviction, or people are, having all kinds of difficulties putting food on the table. There are all kinds of, complex challenges that people are facing, and those oftentimes get disregarded because the disaster seems to be the sort of overwhelming singular event that then comes and imposes suffering. We think about disaster relief as, hey, how do we get people back to normal? And as you said earlier, Shania, the normal is where people are already suffering, right? So, to kind of answer the question, I would say that we've got to develop a sensitivity to a more process-oriented analysis, where we can actually think about how the disaster kind of interrupts life, but that life itself is is a series of struggles and challenges, ongoing processes, right? And this is not not to reduce this only to the language of sort of people are suffering, people are poor, etc., but also that people are fighting, people are struggling, people are pushing back against conditions that are being imposed on them, neoliberal austerity measures, for example, forced displacement, right? These are conditions that are already kind of impinging upon people, and these conditions also kind of seem like disasters. Well, it's like striking images of the aftermath of an earthquake. So I was looking at these photographs from Turkey and Syria right after the devastating earthquake a few years ago. And what was really striking about these images was that it looks very similar to the images of rubble, horrendous destruction in Gaza.
Yeah.
And you think about the agents here are two distinct agents, and we think about one as natural, and the other as sort of war. The Israeli state is bombing civilian populations, etc. But it is interesting that when you start looking at the kind of ways in which people are suffering and struggling, there's less of a neat line we can draw between a disaster situation and what's already happening. So how do we kind of get at the messiness of it is a challenge.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the messiness that what we're kind of trying to unpack really with this season, and that's what Jason and I, with our comrades, have been kind of pondering about for a long time. So let's kind of, this conditions is a nice segue to my next question. And I would like to talk a little bit more about your work in general and the book in particular, because one of the things that really attracted me to your book is your framing in grounded in Marxism. And I don't think we see quite enough kind of engagement with Marxism in disaster studies. So clearly you embrace Marxist framework, at least in this book, right, to write about disasters. Why Marxism, and how did you come to it?
So one of the kind of common threads linking multiple disaster situations around the world, whether these are natural disasters, whether these have to do with war and genocide, or whether this has to do with forced displacement, economic distress, etc., is that the running thread is global capitalism and sort of expansive reach of the destructive kind of dynamics of capitalism is something that I've been trying to grapple with. And I've always been intrigued by the linkages, right, between people who are vulnerable to disasters. How are they made vulnerable? Well, very often through neoliberal austerity measures, through displacement, through economic marginalization. Why are they unable to recover? Well, because of poverty, we're told. But poverty is not some kind of essential condition that people just simply in an ahistorical way simply sit in, right? Poverty is produced, it's constructed, and in the contemporary world today, of course, capitalism is the sort of the big story that often gets ignored, right? Especially in disaster studies. So I wanted to kind of bring to the foreground, and bring to the forefront, our critical questions around capitalism as a what I would describe as a hegemonic and constituting force. Hegemonic because it's not always very visible, very obvious in the conventional discourse. It's not always foregrounded, but it's sort of what underlies many of these kinds of contexts. And this is what allows us to also understand both the normal constitution of the world, as in, where you have rampant unemployment, underemployment, economic distress, etc. And then these disaster situations where, people who are made vulnerable through these sort of inequalities in society are now also struggling with recovery. And then you have states and various powerful private players and nonprofits, etc., engaged in recovery, which scholars like Naomi Klein and others have kind of termed disaster capitalism, right? This way by which you use a disaster as an opportunity now to push for agendas that perhaps were a little harder to do before. So disaster kind of opens up possibilities. And what is happening here is the kind of exploitation of vulnerability. And in the same way that capitalism under normal conditions is constantly looking for ways to exploit vulnerability, disaster situations sort of amplify that particular dynamic. So Marxism allows me to kind of really engage with the more messy questions around power, around inequality, around the production of poverty, around the accumulation of wealth, and the sort of the obverse, right? The production of poverty and the accumulation of wealth. So two related processes, not separate processes. But also it allows us to kind of think more broadly, especially in the era of the climate catastrophe, about the relation between imperialism in the world today and a planetary system that's sort of coming undone in all kinds of ways. Earth system is teetering on the brink, or to think about linking the kind of catastrophic situations that are imposed upon populations through war, through genocide, and the struggle for human futures that have to do not just with sort of averting the impacts of climate change, but also really dealing with capitalism, right? So why Marxism? Well, Marxism offers perhaps a very powerful set of tools, analytical tools that allows us to, for example, think about the material and the social together. And thinking in a kind of historical materialist framework allows us to grapple with ongoing processes, ongoing relationships and contradictions, but also the kind of social dimensions of these, right? Because we're not all affected equally by climate change. We're not all affected equally by disasters, right? This is important. And perhaps another important angle that I find very useful in Marxism is the dialectical method, in that we think about power, and we think about the imposition of power and its sort of demands on populations, but we often fail to take adequately into account the fact that people are not just sort of static objects being acted upon, but they're more often than not fighting. They're struggling, they're organizing, they're conscious of the world that they live in. They want a better world. They articulate demands for better worlds. So this sort of ability to think about power as well as resistance together, and to kind of imagine, understand first the conditions of exploitation. Kind of invoking Gramsci here, right? A kind of pessimism of the intellect, understanding what messy world we live in, right? But also exercising that optimism of the will, where we finding conditions of possibility for liberation, right? That extend beyond like the disaster itself to, what kinds of worlds do human beings around on this planet want, right? So Marxism allows us to kind of really engage at this level, and I can't think of a better kind of set of tools to work with than Marxism in this particular historical moment.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll come back to resistance in just a few minutes. But I want to talk a little bit more about Marxism, and of course you touch upon the Eurocentrism, right, and the way that we kind of discuss disasters from very Eurocentric way of thinking. And there's been quite a lot of critique recently from J.C. Gaillard, A.J. Faz, and a few other comrades, really kind of unpacking this Eurocentric approach in a way that we are dealing and understanding disasters and all the problematics that come with that. And to me, Marxism is kind of very much obviously a Western way of thinking. So in your opinion, how do we reconcile the Western view of Marxism with the need to understand disasters from a non-Western perspective?
So I'm reminded of one conversation that I had the opportunity to listen to between an NGO activist and a community elder in a fishing village in southern India about 15 years ago. Now, the activist was basically talking about how the government is trying to, ride roughshod on the rights of the fishing communities by, in the name of disaster recovery, by, pushing for development projects and saying we want development. Now, the elder was, kind of a highly, very respected member of the community, interrupted the activist and said, "Hold on a second. We're not against development. What we want is to have a say in what constitutes development, what the scope of development is, and link development to our well-being, our needs. See, we need a fishing harbor. We need street lights. We need, these are material aspects of development that are beneficial to us. Right? What we don't want is to be simply driven out of a place in the name of development and told that somehow, this place is being developed, whether or not it benefits people, right? So I think one of the things that I find particularly troubling in much of the critique of Eurocentrism is this assumption that somehow, modernity and developmental modernity is simply a Eurocentric imposition on populations, which completely ignores the fact that people around the world want material well-being. And this material well-being that they want is often couched in demands for very, very, fundamental things: streetlights, paved roads, good sanitation, access to water. Not only that, access to various kinds of, state supports for, subsidizing agricultural production, for example, helping people obtain credit on good terms, on sustainable terms, being able to send their kids to school, right? These are things that constitute development and modernity that are not simply impositions from the West, but are actually part and parcel of the basket of demands that people around the world are making. That said, another facet that sort of I find particularly troubling is sort of ignoring the fact that the so-called non-West has always been at the center of the story of modernity. From the period of the transatlantic slave trade through the period of sort of the rampant of resource exploitation systems that were put in place under colonialism, right? So the one case in point that I talk about in the book is about the history of rubber. If you think about rubber as something that is so ubiquitous and so important to the story of modernity, when you think about the transportation revolution, you look at old photographs from the early 20th century, cities like Brussels, like you have these cars, automobiles, like driving on paved roads, etc., etc. And we think about rubber, how it revolutionized transportation, right? Because the vulcanization of rubber enabled the production of rubber tires that now could allow automobiles to kind of to be more efficient, etc., etc. Now the story of rubber is about massive numbers of human beings in three continents, in Asia and Africa and the Americas, being put to work on rubber plantations, indigenous peoples in Peru and Ecuador, etc., in the Amazon, people in the parts of Central Africa, in the Congo, or people in Southeast Asia and countries like Malaysia, etc. We're working in rubber plantations, producing enormous quantities of rubber that European firms and companies were utilizing to produce vulcanized rubber so they could have their transportation revolution. What happens to these populations? They're seen as, pre-modern, non-modern, they need development, they need modernity. But their story is very much at the center of the story of modernity. Right? Now, this is why I take issue with the sort of blanket denunciations of modernity as if it's some kind of Eurocentric imposition. Right? Now, that said, why is Marxism particularly important to this sort of critical reframing of this history of modernity for me? Well, again, Marxism too has a very complex history. Sure, Marx was a European, was a German, and he wrote in German. Much of his work had a tremendous influence in Europe, but like wildfire, it caught on around the world. None of the anti-colonial struggles, if you look at in the 20th century, would have would have the legacies that they did were it not for a massive amount of interest expressed by anti-colonial or populations fighting colonialism in the legacy of Marx and the work of Marx, right? Of course, through other kinds of very momentous events like the Russian Revolution and the legacy of Lenin and so on and so forth. So Marxism and Marxism-Leninism has always been part and parcel of the kind of the story of modernity, especially on the sort of agentive side of the question, right? From where people are fighting for a better world, people are pushing for an end to colonialism, a demand for socialism, a demand for much more egalitarian society, kind of making a claim on developmental modernity, but in terms that are revolutionary, that are kind of radical. And if you look at the history of the anti-colonial struggles across the three continents of the global South in the 20th century, Marxism is very much part of that story. And so in that sense, I kind of am not fully convinced that in fact, I push back against the idea that Marxism is simply a European idea that gets imposed on non-European populations. I think it is something that is a much more universal legacy, and it's a truly global legacy today, and is being still fought in very kind of politically charged terms around the world. I mean, just last week, the Indian government, a very kind of fascist government, has been going after leaders of the Communist Party in India, and again, goes to show fascist movements, fascist currents in the contemporary era are very much kind of inimical to Marxism. And so perhaps that is a good indicator of how important and how vital Marxism is to contemporary struggles in the world today.
Thanks, Rajat. Yeah, I think you make some really wonderful points there. And I want to move to talk about solidarity and resistance. And it's something that we've come back to many, many times on the podcast. And Ksenia and I have been thinking and writing about solidarity and resistance quite a bit. So I want to start with a quote and read a quote from the book. Here it is. Exploitation does not take place in the absence of at least tacit forms of resistance. When we pay attention to how disasters occur in specific moments in time, where real human beings are not merely victims of exploitation, but also sometimes invested in ongoing struggles to address facets of this exploitation, we shift the focus of disaster studies from simply identifying how inequalities differentially shape experiences and move the focus to the political possibilities inherent in disaster moment. So really love this quote, and just want to ask you how you think we can build more solidarity and resistance to disaster risk creation, and why is it that sometimes we don't really recognize what's possible when we work together? Why do we have so little belief in ourselves, you know?
Thank you for that question, Jason. It's something that I honestly I don't have any magical answers to, but I can share my own kind of meanderings or my thoughts on this, and I'm sure everybody who's been thinking about this has delved into some of the problems and contradictions of our historical movement in this regard. So, disaster risk more generally, I think it needs to be seen as not accidental or interruptive alone, but as constitutive of the normal. Because today, in this world that we live in, capitalism, of course, thrives on the creation and the uneven distribution of risk and vulnerability across the world. Right? Case in point, look at the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh. I'm using the word disaster very specifically. A huge building that housed all of these factories that were producing textiles where workers were producing textiles for European and North American firms, right? Where building codes were not being met, where workers were being forced to work under conditions where people had been complaining about creaking walls and so on and so forth, but they were still forced to work. And when that building collapsed, about 1,500 people, about 1,300 or so people died. They were all killed and murdered through this collapse. That disaster, in a sense, goes to show us that there's something about vulnerability that is not simply accidental to the world. In fact, it's constitutive of the world. In fact, capitalism, H&M or Walmart, etc. All these big corporations need vulnerable Bangladeshi textile workers to put their lives at risk in order to help them shore up their profits. Right? They become wealthy and powerful, and their country's GDPs rise on the backs and the bodies of these workers who are sacrificed. So, in that sense, disaster risk is constitutive. Now, resistance to risk creation then means really clarifying what the relationship is between risk, vulnerability on the one hand, and ongoing patterns of exploitation and exclusion on the other. Okay? Why are people put at risk? How is them being put at risk productive to capital, productive to accumulation and wealth? Because that's where I think the interventions ought to be kind of seriously considered. So we want to avoid disaster risk, but this should also mean should we not pay attention to the struggles of Bangladeshi textile workers to unionize, to push back against an oppressive autocratic neoliberal regime that is forcing them to put their lives at risk, or even go further. Go a little further than that. Why are so many people being displaced from the rural countryside and forced to seek these highly exploitative working conditions in the cities? Right? What's happening in the countryside? The kind of agrarian distress that is being been wreaking havoc upon rural populations throughout South Asia and then the rest of the world. It's happening because of a series of forces that link all of these processes together. Right? So clearly there's a link between exploitation and vulnerability on the one hand. Now, we must also keep in mind that these, again, as I mentioned earlier, these are ongoing struggles, right? That these are not static bodies that are being kind of exploited or made vulnerable by outside forces alone. They're also fighting back. They are pushing back, and these struggles of these people ought to be a starting point. So I was thinking about the cases in cities like New Orleans in the United States after Hurricane Katrina. What do the policymakers do? They decide we've got to get rid of public schools, right? Well, if you just go back a few months before Katrina, you see that school teachers and public school employees have been waging this momentous struggle to unionize, to improve their conditions, to increase school funding. Right? They're fighting to defend their livelihoods and to defend this very, very important public asset. But the disaster comes in, and right after that, you have city officials and state officials saying, this is a great opportunity to get rid of public schools and to open up this sort of privatization of education model. Right? So clearly, the struggles that preceded the disaster were absolutely important and central to anything else that we might consider as recovery after the disaster. Same story with many other cases. The privatization of utilities in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. Right? Again, an imposition of austerity measures that then undermines existing arrangements, and then a disaster strikes, and the disaster is now used as an opportunity to push those austerity measures even further and accelerate the process of dispossession, dislocation, and so on and so forth. So this means that we have to link any form of resistance and solidarity, in terms when we're thinking about disaster risk, to those ongoing struggles that are already part and parcel of people's lives, even before the disaster, and definitely long after the disaster. In the city of New Orleans, for example, the fight over public housing, right? City officials, both driven by racism as well as sort of this extreme level of animosity towards working class populations, or neoliberal policymakers, had been pushing to get rid of public housing for years. And then once Hurricane Katrina devastates the city officials are like, hey, this is a great opportunity to get rid of public housing. But there was the tremendous struggle by community activists, local organizations, unions, and others to defend, to the extent they could, huge swaths of public housing that were being targeted. Right? So again, the fight over public housing, the fight over public education, the fight for healthcare, etc., in light of COVID, etc. These are absolutely important, vital struggles. So no disaster studies scholar or anybody interested in disaster, in addressing disaster issues, can afford to ignore the everyday political struggles of populations around the world, right? And in this era, the fight against genocide, the fight to end the genocide in Gaza, right? These are important struggles. They're not outside of the scope of disaster studies. In fact, they should be centering. We should be centering these issues in disaster studies further and further. So that's how we build a resistance that promises for us a less risky future in terms of disasters, especially in light of climate change. But also, we want a just world. We always say we want an end to this, we want to stop this. But what do we want in the affirmative, in the positive? What kind of world do we want? What do we desire? Right? We want an egalitarian future. We want a future where there is no racism, sexism, homophobia, misogyny. We want a future that is not hyper exploitative, super exploitative. We want an end to capitalism. We want a socialist future. And how might that socialist future take shape and form? I think disaster studies scholars should not hesitate to state that we do indeed have a firm commitment to a socialist future, and that's what we want. And if to get there, we have to build solidarities above and beyond the specific dimensions of disasters that we often get kind of, hyper focused on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all of this is possible, right? If we as disaster scholars, and I use a very broad we here, accept that disasters are political, right? And there is kind of a lot of resistance in a different way to that, in that we still use objective, neutral methods in quotation marks, right? That quantify social science and still show us the percentage of women that are vulnerable, right? And kind of, put people in silos without actually thinking about solidarity and resistance and the kind of the human experience of suffering at the center of this. And this leads me to kind of to our final question that we are asking all of our guests in the season. And you're touching upon, again, this in your work. So you're writing quite a lot in the book about discarding neutrality and embracing politicization. So how do we move the disaster scholarship, and just scholarship in general, academia in general, from the argument that academic work should remain objective and thus very much apolitical?
Well, in this particular moment in the United States, but also I'm pretty sure in Europe as well, there's been a huge pushback against the social sciences and sort of the humanistic approach to thinking about doing scholarly work. So one of the challenges of our time is to address these matters and issues by taking or seriously reconsidering what it means to be a scholar. Scholars themselves are vulnerable today. Many scholars are coming under attack. People are losing their jobs. People are being kind of told not to say certain things, or programs are being shut down. Syllabi are being scrutinized across the especially in the West. We're seeing a lot of this happen in a context where clearly scholarship is seen as a threat. So again, perhaps that's an indicator that scholarship is in fact more important today than ever before, right? Because if they say you shouldn't talk about fossil capitalism, or you shouldn't talk about racism, perhaps that means that the scholarship on fossil capitalism, the critical scholarship on racism, is in fact having an effect, having an impact, and so it's that much more necessary for us to push in that direction. Now, in terms of objectivity, well, one of the biggest drawbacks is this sort of assumption that somehow objective neutral knowledge, right, and that sort of one-dimensional way of thinking about science. I am an advocate of science. I love science, and I think science is absolutely vital and important for every struggle, but a science that is positioned, a science that is directed towards human emancipation, and not a science that simply feigns to be neutral in order to produce some kind of body of knowledge that then can be utilized by powerful entities to drill more oil or find ways to kind of deny people health insurance, etc., etc. Science ought to be kind of placed in this sort of non-neutral way, in solidarity with human emancipatory struggles. And so I think we cannot afford to be apolitical, because being apolitical is not going to protect us, one. And B, being apolitical is in fact the absolutely wrong way to approach the problem we're facing today. Right? This incredible crisis, the combination of a social and economic crisis and a planetary climate crisis. Right? We cannot address any of this stuff by being neutral. So objectivity is important. Why? Objectivity means being able to mobilize and marshal knowledge that is gathered in order to fight those struggles for justice, for emancipatory futures. But objectivism or objectivity that is that disregards the political and economic and historical struggles that are underway is the wrong kind of objectivity. So I would say disaster scholarship today should more firmly position itself in a scientific way, as well as in a kind of humanistic way, where we pay close attention not only to the objective qualities of poverty or marginalization, exclusion, etc., but also to the kind of experience dimensions of life, because this is where human beings are articulating visions or first their experiences and then visions for an alternative, right? Listen, and here's where I'm an anthropologist, and I constantly kind of I'm amazed by how when you actually speak to people and listen to them, they not only are able to tell you very intricate details about the worlds that they live in, but they're also able to share really fascinating visions of the future. Right? Anthropological knowledge or sociological knowledge, social scientific knowledge, can combine the objective dimensions with these sort of experiential dimensions of human life in order to produce compelling narratives, in order to have more of an impact. Now, a lot of disaster studies scholarship tends to kind of frame its goals and objectives in terms of, well, let's inform policymakers so they can make better policy, right? And that in and of itself is not a bad thing. But we ought to ask critical questions as to where are these so-called policymakers on the fundamental questions of unemployment, housing, health, etc. if they're already by and large committed to the privatization of schools, the kind of neoliberal destruction of public assets, etc., then what good is it to go and give them a bunch of information about how to do better with disaster recovery? What does that mean, right? Instead, we should perhaps ask ourselves what kinds of creative organic solidarities we can build with social movements to help social movements struggle and fight for a better world. So I'm just thinking, in the context of disasters having to do with food insecurity, right? Scholarship should, be in the forefront of building alliances and solidarities with Via Campesina, or these great global movements for food sovereignty, for pushing back against sort of the destruction of subsistence agriculture, pushing back against the dislocation of indigenous communities, pushing back against those sort of environmentally destructive projects that are devastating societies in the world today, right? Because these are ways in which I think objective knowledge and the sort of experiential dimension of knowledge, which is brought to which anthropologists and other scholars in the more humanistic social sciences can bring to bear, can be marshaled in defense of these various struggles, and in helping them advance in various ways, because we can produce knowledge that perhaps populations or movements can benefit from. Putting this in a completely different way, we ought to ask ourselves, how can we be useful to the struggle? How can we be useful to the struggle? Oftentimes you think, oh, since we're sitting in the ivory towers of the world, we produce knowledge and we can just go there and kind of start things up, right? More often than not, we go to the trenches, we realize, oh my God, no, we're far behind. I mean, these people are already in an advanced stage of struggle. So we should ask, what is our contribution? How might we, maybe humbling ourselves and saying, what can we bring? And then going to work and saying, here are the different kinds of tools we can bring to bear. Here are the different kinds of strategies. Here's the knowledge and information we can bring into these struggles to help them in various ways. And asking people what they want is important. Now, going back to the question of development, right? The elder in the fishing village said, we're not against development. We want to have a say in the scope and nature of development, right? People are already thinking about these things. How do we contribute to their needs and interests and do that? And then one last point, sorry for going over here.
No, it's great, yeah.
That we too are subjects of history, right? Like to cite Michel Roth-Trouillot here, right? Where we ought to see human beings as actors, agents, and subjects of history. We too are actors, agents, and subjects of history. What is that subjectivity to mean in light of these sort of challenges of building solidarity? What are our local struggles? Are we fighting to defend higher education under assault? Are we fighting to defend public schools in our own lives? Are we taking particular political position? What is our politics where we exist as academics, as scholars, and linking those struggles together? My advisor in graduate school asked me a question that sounded very simple, but it's a question I still grapple with to this day, and I share this with my students all the time. First question to ask when you want to do research: who are you in solidarity with? And that's a question that not only asks who are you sympathetic to, but who do you feel that connection, that political connection to, right? Because our struggles are also part of the story. They're not outside the scope of our academic work and scholarship, right? So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Raja. I think I love that you've left us with a big challenge. Like, how are we useful in the struggle? And I think many of us, grapple with that. And as you know, we all, and many people that might listen to this conversation, are working in neoliberal institutions where there's real kind of risks and tensions that we're dealing with, and that kind of big challenge, having that at the foregrounding that challenge is difficult, right? And because it's very easy to go with the flow when you're in the machine, right? But we really appreciate you spending time with us today. Anybody listening, please check out Raja's book. And we hope we'll have a chance to spend time with you in the future. because I think Disasters Deconstructed listeners will really dig what you're saying and would love to hear more from you. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, I hope everybody enjoyed this episode. Join us next time on 15th of June. We're going to be talking about informality and solidarity in Reconstruction. So looking forward to that. Looking forward to seeing everybody next time. Thank you all. Thanks, Raja. Thanks so much.
Bye.